The nail split sideways from the wood as she drove it in with a rock. No hammer, no gloves, not even a real coat. The thing she was building didn't look like a stove to the men who passed by. It looked like a crooked chimney pipe sunk into a pit with mud caked around the base. Like it had collapsed halfway, and she was too foolish or too proud to start over. She didn't answer their laughter. She didn't look up when one of them said, "You'll cook your own hair off in that thing." The widow's hands were trembling so badly by then she could barely tie the wire bundle that secured the pipe in place. Not from the cold, not entirely, but from how long she'd been holding herself together without a full breath. Her 2 children sat wrapped in her dead husband's coat nearby, their knees pressed together under a shredded quilt, their faces chapped red from the wind. They were too young to understand the snickering, but they understood when she turned to them suddenly and whispered, "Go inside and don't come out unless the roof caves in." There was no inside, not really, just a dirt floor cabin built half from scavenged planks and half from what the snow hadn't swallowed. There were gaps in the wall wider than a man's hand. The door didn't close. It leaned against the frame when the wind let it, but she'd packed the corners with reeds and leaves, and even her old wedding dress, torn and stuffed like insulation. She'd done all that after dark, after walking 4 miles to trade her last eggs for 6 rusty feet of stovepipe and 1 warped iron plate. That was the night they'd buried her husband in the frozen creek bed because the ground was too hard to dig. By dawn, the pipe was standing, and the first snowstorm of the season hadn't even started yet, but it was coming. The day before, the worst night of her life, they told her she'd built it wrong. "You can't just bury the thing," said old Levi, the tanner, as he spat into the snow beside her. "Stove. Needs air. You choke a fire like that, it'll smoke out your house." Others nodded, some genuinely trying to help, others already turning away. "And where's your draft vent?" one asked. "What are you gonna cook on that? Fire ain't got no draw. No chimney rise." She thanked them anyway, quietly. She didn't tell them she'd already tested it that last night. She'd spent hours feeding twigs into the mouth of the tunnel, not the pipe, but the stone and clay channel she'd dug like a trench beside it, watching how the smoke curled, learning how long the heat lingered under the dirt. She didn't tell them she'd slept out here in a blanket on the snow, just to prove to herself it held warmth. She didn't tell them she was more afraid of burning down the cabin than she was of freezing, which was why she'd kept the fire underground. She only said, "I'll try again if I have to," but she knew she wouldn't. She didn't have the strength to. That morning she'd pulled out 1 last log from under the cabin, the one her husband had set aside and said never to burn unless it came to this, a thick cottonwood log, dense and heavy and dry. "It's a set-in log," he used to say. "Put it on when you can't sit no more." Now she could barely lift it. It wasn't meant for a wide flame. It was meant to smolder. That was the trick. Not heat that raced up and vanished, but heat that lingered like a sigh. She lowered it into the earth chamber slowly, like placing a body into a grave. Then she lit the reed bundle beneath and waited to see if it would catch. The wind came harder by afternoon. The sky grayed like iron. Horses were moved inside barns, and smoke from other chimneys flattened sideways with every gust. No one lingered outside long enough to mock her stove again. Inside the cabin, her daughter whimpered. Her son had stopped speaking hours ago. The heat hadn't reached them yet. It was moving, yes. The buried tunnel connecting the fire pit outside to the flat iron plate inside was warm to the touch now, but it would take hours to rise. She fed it what little twigs she had until dusk. Then she closed the hatch. That was it. 1 log, no more to add. It had to last. Night fell, and then the snow came. Not light, not the kind that dances, but thick, wheeling snow with weight to it. Her roof groaned. The cold cracked the dirt, chinking in the walls like gunfire. The wind made a low moan through the trees, but she couldn't hear it inside. She couldn't hear anything but her children breathing, tucked under everything she owned. The iron plate beside them, no brighter than a black rock, but warm. She placed her hand over it again, then her cheek, warm, and still she wept. Not because it had worked, not yet, but because she knew there was no more to try, nothing else to fix or mend or rebuild. If it failed, it would fail while they slept. If it worked, they might live. It was the not knowing that broke her down, the waiting. She pressed her lips to the iron like a prayer. "Please stay warm, please stay warm." Sometime in the night, she woke choking. The air was thick, too thick. Smoke? She sprang upright and scrambled toward the hatch. The tiny, reed-covered exhaust tunnel she'd built outside, 20 feet away, barely above the snowdrift. She yanked open the side door. A blast of snow slammed into her chest. Her breath caught, not from the cold, but from what she saw, the pipe was buried. The snow had drifted over it completely. She shoved forward through knee-high powder, dragging her skirts, coughing, clawing toward the end of the tunnel where the smoke should have vented. Her fingers found the tip and dug like an animal, cleared it, waited again. Then a whisper of grey. The smoke flowed free. She leaned forward, arms trembling, lips near frostbitten, but the warmth, faint as it was, still rose from beneath. She whispered aloud, voice cracking, "Thank you." When she returned inside, the children hadn't stirred. The cabin was warm. No, it was hot. She knelt down and touched the plate again. It was radiating. Even the dirt beside it steamed faintly. She could see her breath, but it didn't sting. Her toes, even uncloaked, didn't ache. The log was still burning, still pushing heat through a tunnel of clay and packed stone, redirected upward by a bend she'd formed with a broken pan and 3 bricks. The smoke moved low and slow, like a river under the snow. She smiled. Then she lay down beside her children and closed her eyes. At dawn, someone knocked on the wall. Not the door, the wall. The snow had blocked the entrance entirely. She rose, shoved it open with her shoulder, and saw Levi standing there with 3 others, their eyes wide, breath fogging like dragon smoke. "We come check on you," he muttered. She stepped aside. They entered. They stood for a long time without speaking, looking at the glowing iron, at the children asleep without shivering, at the walls that hadn't collapsed. Then one man muttered, "That's the damnedest stove I ever seen," and Levi, shaking his head, took off his hat. "She built it wrong," he said softly, "but it worked." And outside, the wind still howled, but it no longer reached them. She hadn't slept more than 2 hours at a stretch in over a week, and yet she didn't feel tired, not in the way she used to, not in the way grief and cold had dulled her body. There was an edge to her now, like metal left out in the frost. Thin, sharp, reflective. As Levi stood near the stove in silence, brushing his glove over the warm iron with visible disbelief, she realized that the men weren't there to offer help. Not truly. They were there because they couldn't make sense of what they'd heard. That she had survived, that her children had survived, that the stove they had mocked had done something theirs had barely managed, kept a home warm on a night when the sky itself felt like it might crack open and bury the world in white. No one had slept easy that night. Fires had gone out. Chimneys had backed up. Even the barkeep's place, supposedly the warmest in town with its thick stone hearth and double-walled chimney, had suffered from smoke blowback. 2 children had nearly suffocated in their loft. But here, this broken shack, this dirt-floored half-dugout clinging to the edge of the valley, was warm and dry and still. She crouched to pour warm water from a pot she'd left on the plate overnight. It hadn't boiled, no, but it was above lukewarm, enough to keep frostbite from her children's fingers. They stirred now, faces pink rather than grey, their eyes fluttering open, not in panic but in drowsy, childlike confusion. "Mama," her daughter whispered. "I'm here, love," she said, brushing hair from her forehead. "Is it morning?" She didn't answer at first. Her eyes lifted past the child, past the men still standing dumbfounded, to the grey shape of the doorway. Snow had climbed halfway up its frame again. The sky beyond was still white, blizzard thick and restless. But yes, technically it was morning. She nodded. "It is." Her son sat up beside them. "The stove," he whispered hoarsely, touching the iron plate with the palm of his hand. "It's still warm, still warm." Those words echoed in the silence, and none of the men spoke. They'd all seen stoves go cold in hours, even good ones, even with full logs. The idea that a single log, a single, tightly packed smolder log, sealed underground, could still be heating this place after so long, troubled something in them, something they hadn't learned from their fathers or books or the traveling tinsmiths who sold their wagons of stove parts each fall. She stood slowly, back stiff, hands calloused and bleeding. "It's just a trench," she said simply. "A trench with a pipe and a bend in the middle. I packed it with stones and dirt. The heat moves underground, real slow. It doesn't need flame." "You used a Dakota fire," muttered one of the men at last. "Like the scouts do." She blinked. She hadn't heard that term before. Levi scoffed. "Nah, scouts build quick fires. This here's more like what them root sellers do. Holding heat, not making it fast." She didn't respond. Let them name it what they wanted. She hadn't built it from a design, just desperation. She'd seen how rocks stayed warm, longest underground, how tunnels drew wind even when no one thought they would. She'd listened, observed, tried, failed, and tried again. That was all. But now they were quiet, and that silence stretched. Finally, Levi cleared his throat and took a step back. "Well, you proved us wrong," he said, voice low. "Storm's not easing yet, but if it does, folks might want to see this, might want to learn it." She said nothing, because now that the crisis had passed, something deeper than cold or survival began to creep in, something she hadn't let herself feel until now. Grief, real grief. The stove had worked, the children were alive, and her husband was still gone. She didn't eat that morning, only gave the last of the cornmeal mush to the children. They licked the bowls clean, giddy with the warmth in their limbs, unaware how much of their mother's strength had gone into that final night. Her knuckles were bruised black, her eyes red-rimmed and sunken, but still she kept moving, kneeling to check the tunnel, clearing the vent again, tamping the snow down away from the wall where smoke could settle. The heat was still coming, thinner now, but steady. The log was charcoal at this point, a dense glowing ember nested inside the earthen channel. It had burned all night, and would likely smolder until late afternoon. Then nothing. No more wood, no more twigs, no more set in logs. The reality was simple. They were safe now, but only for a day, maybe two if the sun broke. But the snow hadn't stopped, and even now, from the rise above her cabin, she could see it stretching like an ocean over the hills, a white sheet that had swallowed fences and paths, and even the upper roofs of the wagon yard down by the creek. The town was buried, and it was still snowing. It was the schoolteacher who came first, a girl, barely 20, cheeks windburnt and lips split from the cold. She wore a too-thin cloak and carried a burlap sack in one hand, a rolled paper in the other. "I heard," she said breathlessly. "Is it true you—" "It's warm?" The widow nodded. The girl pushed inside and dropped beside the stove with a cry, holding her hands to the plate like it was the last fire on earth. "It's warmer than the school," she whispered. "I've 3 of my girls holed up in the attic under a hay pile. We couldn't keep the fire lit. The chimney's cracked. Everything backs up." The widow poured a cup of water and held it out. The teacher stared at her with such disbelief, not just at the water but the fact it was warm, that her eyes filled with tears. "How?" The widow sat beside her and gestured to the floor. "There's a tunnel under this plate, buried deep. The fire's outside. It draws through the earth, under the house, and rises here. Slow, real slow." The teacher looked toward the door. Could you show me?" "No," said the widow. "It's snowed over again. Could you tell me?" She hesitated, then she nodded. That afternoon, more came. A father with his 2 sons, their faces pale and noses bleeding from frostbite. A pair of young ranch hands who'd lost the trail back to their shack and had walked all night, following smoke. The baker's wife, whose oven had gone cold and who feared for her newborn. All came not for charity, but for warmth, and she gave it. She taught them how to dig low, how to channel wind, not block it, how to trap heat, not chase flame, how to build with the ground, not above it, how to smother a log in its own breath and still make it glow. They sat in her cabin long into the night, close, crowded, sharing food and blankets. The stove never flamed once, and still it radiated. But in her mind she knew it would not last. Without more wood, it would cool by dawn. She needed help, not for her, but for the children. That night she returned to the creek bed, to his grave. It wasn't much, a pile of rocks, a frost-covered scrap of his coat marking the head. She knelt and placed her hand against the stone. "I made it work," she whispered. "The stove, it worked." The wind didn't answer. "I kept them warm. I did what you said. I burned the log." Still nothing. "But they're coming now. People, they want to know. They want me to teach them. I don't know how. I didn't mean to. I didn't know it." Her voice cracked, and finally she said what she hadn't allowed herself to say for days. "I can't do this without you." Her hands gripped the stone, her breath hitched in her throat. She wanted to scream, but all she did was bury her face in the snow and cry silently until the tears froze on her cheeks. The next morning, someone left a bundle of kindling at her door. She never saw who. Then a few hours later, a sawed log, awkwardly cut, half frozen but clean and dry. Then another, and by dusk, her woodpile had grown to 6 full pieces, enough for 3 more burns, enough for 3 more nights. She stared at the pile as the last visitor left, her heart pounding. No one claimed the gifts. No one asked for thanks, and in that moment she realized they weren't mocking her anymore. They were listening, they were watching, and perhaps they were learning. The 3rd night after the storm, there was no sky, only a ceiling of white, like the stars themselves had vanished. The wind no longer howled, but neither had it stopped. It was the kind of stillness that made even the strongest men uneasy, like the world had forgotten to breathe. But inside the widow's cabin, the plate glowed soft and amber, and 17 souls sat in silence, listening to the heartbeat of heat as if it were a hymn. She no longer had the place to herself. The last 2 days had turned her shack into a sanctuary. They came because they heard it was warm. They stayed because it stayed warm longer than any fire in town. And they listened when she spoke, not because she claimed to be wise, but but because she never raised her voice. She told them plainly what she did, how she did it, and why it worked. And always she added, "I didn't invent it, I just paid attention." That phrase, "I just paid attention," began to circulate like scripture. Even the smith, a man who'd scoffed when she first asked for pipe without coin, now came each dusk with cracked palms full of wood shavings, offering them like tithes. The school teacher returned with drawings she'd made of the trench pattern. She traced the airflow, the way heat moved through soil, and hung it above the door where all could see. A boy offered nails. A girl brought an old bucket, rusted through, but perfect for lining a vent curve. They no longer came to question, they came to learn, and still the stove burned. That night she didn't cry, not because the grief had passed, but because there was no time for it. People needed her now, and maybe that was enough. On the fourth morning, the snow broke, not melted, not even close, but the clouds opened, and light struck the hills in a way it hadn't in days. The storm was not over, but it had lessened. You could see the tops of trees again, chimneys reappeared, and the shapes of cabins and barns took form beneath the drifts. It was Levi who brought the news. He came just before dawn, face windburned, gloves soaked to the wrist. "They're gathering in the church," he said. "Meeting, town wants to figure out what to do next. Roads are blocked, wagon yards under 2 feet, wood shipments are frozen, half the stoves are smoking back through the flue. We ain't got enough food, not enough warmth." She nodded. "What do they want with me?" "They want to see it," he said, "for themselves." So she packed her hair beneath a shawl, kissed her children on the head, and followed Levi through the drift toward the chapel at the center of the valley. It had once been a Catholic church, whitewashed with stained windows, now long darkened with soot and patched in places with hide and burlap. Inside, the benches were full, ranchers, trappers, widows, merchants. Some were coughing, some weeping silently. Most were simply quiet, not from reverence, but exhaustion. There was no preacher, only the mayor, a short man with rheumy eyes and a wild beard, standing near the altar with a sheaf of wet papers. Levi cleared his throat. "She's here." Heads turned, dozens of them. She stepped forward. No one clapped. No one greeted her with warmth. They just looked. A woman in a patched coat and bent boots. A mother who had built a stove that shouldn't have worked but did. "Is it true?" someone asked aloud. "You kept that place hot on one log?" "I kept it warm," she said. "Not hot and not with flame." "How?" So she told them. How she dug a trench, how she lined it with rock and broken brick, how she bent it under the house and capped it with flat iron from the scrap pile, how she buried the fire deep enough to smolder, shallow enough to rise, how she let the air draw from a vent no wider than her wrist, and how the smoke followed the cold while the heat followed her floor. "Your logs must be better," someone muttered. "They're not," she said. "Then it was luck," another huffed. "I've tried luck," she replied. "It doesn't burn long." A few chuckled, most didn't, but the mayor raised his hand. "Can you show us?" "Yes," she said. "Can we build it?" "Yes, but not quick." The room fell into murmurs. Someone stood up. "We've got families freezing in barns, children dying in lean-tos," another added. "Then help me dig," she said, and silence returned. She did not beg, she did not plead. She simply looked each of them in the eye, one by one, and waited. And slowly, one by one, they began to nod. That afternoon, they dug. Not one trench, but 6, not one stove, but 7. Men who had never lifted a shovel for another man's wife now worked shoulder to shoulder, hauling earth, packing stones, bending pipe. The smith brought his entire barrel of nails. The wheelwright offered his unused hub rings to form vent mouths. Even the banker's son, spoiled, useless before now, bruised his palms hauling bricks. The widow led them all, kneeling in snow, clearing angles, adjusting. Draft, teaching without pause, without pride, without condition. She didn't ask for thanks, she only showed them how to make it work. By dusk, the first trench glowed. By nightfall, 2 more. Families moved in, huddled together under the rafters of half-buried shacks, laying flat over their new stoves, watching in awe as the plates rose from cold to warm to hot, not with flame, but with embered breath. The town had never seen such heat, not without fire, not without smoke, not without danger, and all from dirt and stone and a single log. By the 5th day, it had a name. They called it the widow's stove, no matter how wrong it sounded, no matter how simple it was. And from that name, something new began to spread. Respect. She didn't notice it at first. She was too tired, too hungry, too busy. But it was in how they looked at her now, how they waited for her to speak, how they offered food without asking, or set aside extra twigs when they passed by. Children whispered her name like it belonged in stories. And still she did not rest, because the cold had not stopped, and neither had the need. It was the 7th night, the coldest yet, when the real test came. The teacher's stove collapsed, not from flaw, but sabotage. Someone had knocked over the vent stack, packed the trench with snow. The fire died. The children inside began to freeze. When the teacher stumbled into the widow's cabin, frost caked on her lashes and breath thin with panic. The widow didn't speak. She simply grabbed her shawl, her shovel, and a bundle of dried grass. She ran, in the darkness, through knee-high snow, toward the fallen stove. She found it half buried. The trench entrance collapsed. Inside, she heard crying, whimpers, the silence of terror. She fell to her knees and began to dig, not with care, with fury. Clumps of ice tore her nails. Her breath wheezed in her throat, but she dug. The trench opened. The tunnel cleared. She relit the bundle, fed it, watched, and the glow returned. The plate began to breathe again. Heat, not much, but enough. She collapsed inside beside the teacher and her 3 pupils, wrapping them in blankets, holding their hands, singing a lullaby with a voice that cracked halfway through. They did not die. They slept. And in the morning, they told the town what she had done, that she had come, that she had saved them, that the stove had worked again. Even broken, it had worked. Even sabotaged, it had returned. Because she never stopped, because she paid attention. And by sunrise, the town no longer called it the widow's stove. They called it the life stove, and they began to build more. The storm finally broke on the 9th day, not with sunlight, not entirely, but with the wind dying enough that the smoke from chimneys rose straight again, not sideways. The sky lost its choking grayness and began to resemble something closer to a dawn. Pale blue filtered over the frozen valley like a promise too faint to believe in. Yet still the frost clung to the windows like old memories, and the snow sat in heaps so tall that fences and signs were buried under waves of white. But in the houses, those with the new stoves, the cold had been turned back, not beaten, not broken, but kept at bay long enough for the weak to sleep through the night. She stood in the center of what had become more than a cabin, more than a shelter. It was now a workshop, a meeting place, a hearth for a village slowly gathering itself after the freeze. A pile of new pipe lay against the back wall, donated from a rancher who'd salvaged it from a barn fire years ago. Coils of wire, old shovels, even broken pans were stacked beside sacks of soil, dug from under the woodmill where the ground had remained soft. The widow's hands were blistered raw, wrapped now in scraps from her husband's old shirt, but she moved through the crowd with that same quiet urgency, showing where to bend the trench, where to layer the ash, where to place the first kindling. And the people followed. They didn't ask why anymore. They only asked how. By the 10th day, something extraordinary began to happen. The stoves worked, but not only in the way the widow had made them. Others began to adapt, to innovate, to try different bends or materials. A blacksmith used iron fence posts for a longer tunnel. A hunter packed clay tighter and carved narrow slits along the channel to allow seeped warmth to radiate upward before reaching the final plate. A boy of no more than 12 used a broken wagon wheel rim to fashion a new kind of draft collar that increased the heat at the curve. And each evening they came back to her to share what they'd tried. She never claimed ownership. She only nodded and quietly said, "Tell the next one how you did it." And so they did. The knowledge spread like heat through stone, slow, unseen, but enduring. By the 12th day, the town had more than stoves. It had hope. Not everyone embraced it. There were still some who clung to their cast-iron Franklin stoves, still trying to feed 3 logs at a time, and wondering why the smoke made their children cough. One merchant refused to believe it could work without a chimney. Another accused her of sorcery. "You're burning the logs underground," he sneered. "You're hiding the smoke like a witch." She didn't answer. She didn't have to, because by now, the sheriff himself had a life stove in his own quarters, built with his own hands, under her guidance, and his newborn daughter hadn't coughed in 4 days. Let the rumors come, let the doubters mutter. The results were standing, breathing, alive. But on the 13th day, the ice cracked, not metaphorically, not in some town meeting or whispered argument. It literally cracked. The old bridge on the south bend of the river gave way under the weight of snow piled against its upper planks, which had thawed just enough under sunlight to weaken the joints. It groaned once, then shattered in a thunderclap that echoed through the valley like a cannon. A man screamed. He'd been crossing it with a sledload of kindling for the widow. By the time they reached him, he was trapped waist-deep in freezing current. 2 others tried to pull him, but the weight of the logs dragged him down. The widow, arriving minutes later, didn't hesitate. She stripped off her coat, tied the sleeves to a sapling, and waded in herself, barefoot, no gloves, rope clenched in her teeth. "Take my hand," she ordered, voice louder than any had ever heard. The man was barely conscious, lips purple, eyes glazed. She yanked him free. Others pulled them both to shore. The logs were gone, but the man lived, and so did she. They brought her back to her cabin, and wrapped her in blankets. The children wept, holding her fingers, which had gone white at the tips. Her breath came shallow. The teacher knelt beside her with tears in her eyes, whispering, "You shouldn't have gone." But the widow only murmured, "He was bringing wood." That night the town stood vigil, not just for her, but for what she'd built. Dozens came. Some left quiet gifts: food, clean bandages, thread and needles, even a fresh pair of boots. The sheriff himself stood guard by the door for 2 hours, saying nothing. When she finally woke, her hands bandaged, lips cracked, she looked around the room and saw all of them. The children sleeping beside the plate, the townsfolk half dozing in corners, the scent of stew on the fire, not hers but brought from someone else's pot. And she whispered, "The stove? Still warm, still breathing, still alive." By the 15th day, word had spread beyond the valley. A courier from a neighboring settlement arrived with frost on his eyebrows and asked, "Where's the woman with the dirt stove?" They led him in. He stood awkwardly for a moment, glancing at the plate. "They say you built it wrong," he said at last, "but it worked." She smiled faintly. "I've got a letter," he said, pulling a crumpled sheet from inside his coat. "From the mayor of Three Pines. Says their chimney bricks cracked, smoke backed into the orphanage. 3 children died. They want to know if you'll send plans, a drawing, anything." She looked down at her hands, still trembling, still healing. Then she nodded. "No plans," she said, "but I'll write what I can." The teacher stepped forward. "I'll draw." The courier nodded. "We'll pay," but she raised a hand. "No payment, just tell them. Teach someone else." He nodded again, this time slower, respectfully, and left. That night, she sat beside the iron plate, still warm, still glowing, and dictated every step, every mistake, every change she'd made. The teacher scribbled it down in neat, careful hand. The schoolboy, the one who'd built the draft collar, added his notes too. Others chimed in. It was no longer one stove, it was many, and it was spreading. By the 20th day, when the main trail finally opened and a supply sled creaked into town for the first time in 3 weeks, the driver stepped down and stared at the strange pipes poking up through snow-covered roofs. "What in blazes happened here?" he muttered. Levi, who had been waiting by the stables, only smiled and said, "The cold came. And we learned how to listen to the dirt." Spring would come late that year. It would be months before the last of the snow cleared, months before the widow's feet fully healed, before her children stopped asking if the stove was still warm. But the memory would not fade, not from the town, not from the travelers who passed through and asked, "Is this where the stove woman lived?" And not from the pages of the notebook the teacher carefully sealed and sent downriver, a notebook now copied and passed hand to hand, valley to valley. The widow's stove, they still called it, but she never once claimed the name. She only said, "It wasn't the stove that saved us. It was paying attention. It was trying. It was burning one log the right way." And so others tried too. They bent pipe. They dug shallow. They listened to the breath of the earth. And when the next freeze came, because in those parts, the freeze always returned, they were ready. Because of her, because of the woman who built it wrong and made it work. The years would not record her name in stone. There was no statue built, no portrait hung, no plaque nailed to the town hall declaring the date she changed everything. And yet, for those who lived through that winter, there was no forgetting her, especially not when winter returned. Because it did return, harder, colder, meaner, 2 years later. A freeze deeper than any old-timer had seen. A stillness that came down so suddenly the wells froze over before breakfast, and whole flocks of sheep were found standing, stiff, mid-step in fields where they'd tried to move just minutes too late. But that time, the town did not panic, because the ground had already been dug, because the plates were already warm, because the stoves were already breathing, and the widow, older now, quieter, hands forever marked with the scars of that first frost, stood on her knees in the dark of her cabin and lit her first trench fire of the season with a bundle of dry grass and a match she'd wrapped in wax to keep dry. The plate pulsed with its familiar warmth. She didn't cry. She simply sat beside it with her daughter, now tall and sharp-eyed, and whispered, "Don't ever build it like they tell you, just to please them. Build it so it works. Build it so it keeps someone alive." The girl nodded. The boy, now no longer a child, had begun digging a deeper trench weeks earlier, having noticed how snow tended to settle differently near the slope behind the house. "The soil holds heat longer there," he'd told her. And he was right. She didn't need to teach him anymore. He had paid attention. Down in the valley, more stoves had risen. The school now had 3, each hidden beneath floorboards, connected by buried tunnels that glowed through slatted vents. The butcher's place, once the coldest shop in town, had heat so consistent now that the meat barely froze. People no longer mocked the strange curves of their homes. They no longer laughed at pipes that stuck out sideways from the ground, or at vent holes dug into snowbanks like rabbit dens. They understood now. Heat didn't care how it looked. It only mattered where it moved. They had learned that from her, and not just here. 3 Pines, then Dalebrook, then Harrow Hollow, all towns downriver, all too small to matter on any map, but all had copied the trench stove. Letters arrived now, not with coins but with thanks. One from a teacher whose students had survived a night at 40 with only 2 logs. Another from a widow whose child had stopped coughing once the life stove had been built. Another still from a man who had laughed at her once, who admitted it freely, but now taught others the method in a town 3 ridges west. He ended his letter with 5 words. I was wrong. Thank you. She kept that one, folded it carefully, placed it under her husband's old coat which now hung by the stove she had first built. There were visitors now and then, strangers from distant counties, riding up on mules or trudging in on foot. Some were officials, some were builders. One claimed to be from a railroad company interested in alternative heat solutions for far line stations. She offered them tea, told them what she knew, never charged a cent, and when one of them offered gold, she simply looked at it and said, "Will that keep your wife warm when the logs run out?" He left red-faced, but respectful. Her own cabin changed too, not from luxury, never that, but the walls were sealed now, packed tight with straw and clay. The roof no longer groaned in the wind. A second stove had been added, not for more heat but for teaching, a place where she could walk others through it, where they could build it with their own hands beside her, one stone at a time. They came from all walks, women from deep hollers whose chimneys smoked them blind, teen boys sent by fathers who didn't believe in dirt methods, but whose wives had insisted they learn, elderly men who'd lost grandchildren in past freezes and would never let another winter pass without change. She taught them all, patiently, calmly, but never delicately. When they messed up, she showed them. When they argued, she let them. When they claimed they had better ways, she invited them to try. Some succeeded, some didn't, but the learning stayed, because she made them build it with their own hands. That was the rule. If you don't bleed on a shovel, she said, you won't trust it when the cold comes. They remembered that. Years passed. Children grew. Some moved away. Some stayed. Her daughter married the boy who once invented the curved vent collar. They built their home 3 ridges over, carved into the side of a bluff, where the soil stayed warm even in February. Their stove burned a single log every 2 days. It fed the whole house. They brought her grandchildren. And her son? He left for a time, traveled with a freight group that delivered salt and wool to the far north. But every winter he came back, not just to see her, but to build. He'd learned to dig fast, to seal air pockets, to use local stone that held heat better than iron. He spoke little, but when he did, it was with clarity. One night he said to her, I saw a cabin up in the upper pass. Had a vent like yours. She nodded. They didn't even know your name. She smiled. They don't have to. But they built it the same. She nodded again. Then they built it right. Then one winter came, a sharp one, cruel and bitter, and the widow, now graying at the temples, fell sick. The fever came fast. She stayed quiet about it for 2 days, still teaching, still tending to her trench. But on the 3rd night, her daughter found her collapsed beside the stove, her lips cracked, breath shallow. They carried her to the cot, laid her beside the first stove she had ever built, now bricked and lined with years of ash and soot, but still working. She slept for 3 days. The town came quiet. Fires were kept lit. Meals were left on her windowsill. People whispered prayers. When she woke, her voice was almost gone. But the first thing she asked was, did the trench hold? Her daughter nodded, tears in her eyes. Yes, Mama, it did. The widow closed her eyes again and whispered, then it's enough. She did not pass that winter. She saw another spring, but she knew her time was coming. So she wrote it all down, not in one book, but in many, simple pages, plain language, no pride, no fancy talk, just the truth. What she learned, what worked, what didn't, where heat traveled, how soil held it, what kind of log burned longest, how to make fire last a night, then 2, then more. She ended each booklet the same way. This stove was built wrong, but it saved us. Yours might be different. Just pay attention. Try. Build what works, not what's expected. 1 log is enough, if you listen. They bound those notes in cloth, passed them on, stored them in schools, in barns, in trading posts, and when the freeze came again, the stoves lit, not just in her town, but beyond, because she had built it wrong, and it had worked, because she paid attention, because she tried, because she never gave up, and because somewhere deep under the snow, 1 log was always burning. They came from as far as the Bitterroot Range that next winter, bundled in furs and patched boots, riding behind oxen too. Tired to protest, just to see the trench in person. Not the widow, not anymore. Her name was whispered gently now. in the way folks only speak about someone whose life had become legend while they were still alive. She hadn't died, not yet, but something about the way she moved through town, slow and watchful, always wrapped in a thick wool cloak with leather mittens over hands she could no longer quite close. It gave her a ghostly weight. People cleared paths for her without thinking. They leaned in when she spoke. They didn't interrupt. And when strangers approached, asking questions, it was rarely her who answered anymore. It was those she had taught, and they taught with the same slow, careful certainty that she had. Never loud, never boastful. Always with hands in the dirt, drawing trench patterns, sketching airflow with sticks in the snow. You got two options, one would say. You can burn fast and loud and wake up cold by morning, or you can let the heat move like breath under the floor, slow and quiet. That's what she did. That's how we still do it. Some brought blueprints. Some brought strange ideas. Metal tubing from railcars, copper loops they swore would draw heat better, even thin slats of charcoal-sealed clay pressed from factory molds in the south. She didn't stop them. She never claimed ownership, but when asked directly, she'd lean on her cane, nod to the soil and say, "The dirt hasn't changed. You want heat to stay? It needs to move like a river, not a flood." That saying caught on. They put it on pages, painted it above cellar doors. Heat like a river, not a flood. One trader even stitched it into the lining of a child's winter coat he sold up north. But she didn't need the recognition. She had the stove, and the memory of the night it saved them. That was all she ever needed. Then came the man from the east. He arrived with a team of 3 and a polished notebook under one arm. His boots had never seen mud. His gloves were city leather, and his coat was tight-fitted wool too stiff to bend right. He introduced himself as Mr. Eldridge from the Bureau of Winter Settlements. A new initiative, he said, meant to catalogue survival methods across the territories. He asked for her by name. When they pointed him toward the cabin, he stood in her doorway with the posture of someone who expected the world to rearrange itself around him. "I've read the reports," he said. "This ground stove of yours has drawn quite a bit of attention. I'd like a demonstration." She didn't answer, just nodded once and motioned to the fire pit outside. She was too tired now to speak much. The pain in her joints came like waves, but she still moved with purpose. She knelt, slowly, wincing, and lit the trench the same way she had years ago. Dried reed, birch bark, one split log, set with the curve angled downwind. Then she waited. So did he. 10 minutes passed. He frowned. "I don't see any flame." She pointed toward the inside of the cabin. He followed, grumbling, and froze at the door, because the plate was already warm. No smoke, no crackling, just heat, rising slow and steady through iron that barely glowed. She finally spoke, voice hoarse. "It's not for light, it's for life." He stepped forward, knelt, touched the plate, then lifted a strange glass tube from his pocket and pressed it to the surface. It hissed. He jotted something down. After a long silence, he asked, "And how long does it hold?" "1 log, 10 hours, she rasped. "No airflow loss, not if the trench is right. And it doesn't ignite the floor?" She lifted her eyes to him. "Not once." He stood, paused, then asked something no one had in years. "Why did you build it that way?" She looked past him then, toward the children asleep on her floor. Not hers anymore, but fostered orphans from the North Trail who'd lost their parents to frostbite after their wagon overturned near the pine stretch. She nodded toward them. "For them," he wrote more. Then to her surprise, he said, "We could use this, officially. Teach it. Fund it. Might save hundreds come next deep freeze." She didn't nod, didn't speak, just leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes, and in a voice barely above a whisper said, "Then do it right. Don't polish it. Don't name it after me. Just teach the dirt. Let it breathe." He paused again. Then he folded his notebook slowly and left. That night he stayed in the teacher's old room, and he built his first trench stove with his own hands. By morning he wept at the warmth. Later that month, the town finally gave the cabin a new roof. Not out of pity, but reverence. Half the ridge showed up with hammers and thatch. Children carried shingles. One woman brought nails carved with tiny flowers etched on the heads, claiming her mother would have wanted them used for something that mattered. She sat watching it all with her hands in her lap. Her daughter knelt beside her and asked, "Is it strange, having so many people in your home now?" The widow smiled faintly. "It was never mine. Just a place that held the fire." Her daughter leaned her head on her shoulder. "You could move in with us. Warm walls, your own room." But the widow shook her head. "This is where the stove started. When I'm gone, let it stay lit. For anyone." They didn't argue. They knew better. The frost came late that year. By the time the rivers froze, 26 trench stoves had been dug across the region. By the time the first blizzard roared down from the hills, the town was ready. They didn't just survive. They taught. Whole families came to build. Neighbors dug trenches for one another. There were no more orphans sleeping under hay piles. No more children lost in the dark. And in the cabin at the edge of the valley, the widow lay with her hands folded, listening to the slow pulse of heat beneath her floor. She knew, not from sound, but from feel, that it was still working, still drawing, still keeping someone else alive. And when her final breath came, it came not in agony or fear, but in warmth. She left them gently, surrounded by those who had once needed her warmth, and who now carried it inside them like coals. They buried her near the trench, and planted a stone that read only, "She paid attention." In the decades that followed, the design was adapted, expanded, improved, but never forgotten. Some called it an earth draft heater. Others named it a trench flow system. In some places, it became a rite of passage. Every new settler dug one before winter, guided by neighbors who had once knelt in the same soil. But the story remained, told in quiet tones during first snows, passed from mother to daughter, father to son, neighbor to neighbor, about the widow who built it wrong and made it right, about the fire that didn't rise in smoke or fury, but breathed steady under frozen ground, holding life like a promise, about a stove that burned a single log and kept a town alive. Years passed, then decades, and still the trench stoves glowed, not with the brightness of flame, but with the kind of heat that lingers through silence, through snowfall, through generations of people who never knew her name, but lived because her hands once dug into frozen dirt and didn't stop. The old cabin stood longer than anyone expected. Its walls were braced 3 times, the roof replaced twice, and the trench below had to be redone every so many years. But the original iron plate, blackened and smooth from years of radiating warmth, stayed right where she'd placed it. Children laid their hands on it like it was a sacred relic. Newcomers sat around it and listened to the stories, some skeptical, others wide-eyed, and every story began the same way. There was a woman long ago who built her stove wrong. No one ever called her weak anymore. The legend of her foolishness, how she packed dirt instead of brick, buried her fire instead of building a chimney, made a stove without a single flame visible, that had become part of the miracle, because it had worked. Because the very thing she was mocked for had saved lives, because she had refused to back down when every man with a hammer and a mustache told her she was doing it all wrong, because the cold came, and she was ready. Now, her method traveled farther than she ever could. It spread by word of mouth, by dog-eared pages copied in shaky handwriting, by boys who became men who never forgot the way their mother pointed at the dirt floor and said, "Warmth comes from below, not above." Ranches across the northern ranges had life stoves by default. Sodbusters in the high plains built trench channels before they finished their roofs. And in towns where freight arrived only twice a year, her design became gospel. A fire pit dug beneath a rise, a pipe laid sideways, a draft collar at the vent mouth, a warm plate where the air rose up gentle and invisible. The Bureau of Winter Settlements eventually included it in their official training manual, printed with diagrams sketched by a teacher who'd once knelt in her home, holding a child whose fingers had been spared by one night of soft, smoldering heat. But even the printed name, Subsurface Convection Draft Heater, Type W, never stuck. People still called it the widow's stove, quietly, with reverence, but even reverence dims given enough time. There came a generation, 30, maybe 40 years after her death, that didn't quite believe in the original story anymore. Not that the stove didn't work. That part was obvious. The design had been tested and proven. But the part about a single woman building it alone, from scraps and grief and desperation, that began to sound too neat, too poetic, something added in the telling. Some called it frontier myth. Others thought it was a metaphor, a way to personify collective invention, like folk heroes who never existed but represented something true. The younger builders scoffed. "No way she figured all that out without training," one said. "She must have copied an old military design. She was just the first to popularize it," another added. "Doesn't mean she invented anything." The old-timers didn't argue. They just kept digging their stoves the way she taught them, and waited, because the cold always returned, and when it did, stories felt less like legends and more like instructions. One such winter came harder than expected. A freak early frost, sudden and merciless, with wind that tore the bark from trees and snow that dropped in thick, wet sheets. It came in the last weeks of harvest, before most homes had stacked wood or sealed their cracks. Chimneys clogged, pipes froze. The new heaters in the southern-built cabins failed before the 3rd night. It was then that the doubters remembered the trench. One boy, the same who had laughed at the crude design in class, was found building a draft tunnel behind the schoolhouse at dawn, his hands bleeding, his knees soaked, muttering to himself the exact words written on the old notebook kept in the town hall archive. "Dig wide at the bend, narrow at the vent, let the smoke chase cold, and the heat chase home." He didn't know who wrote it, but he built it, and that night 15 children slept warm, not from luck, but because someone paid attention. Her own family had long since scattered. Her daughter passed during a flood season many years later, buried beside her mother, with a river stone carved only with the word tried. Her son moved north and married a woman who had survived her own deep freeze. Together they taught others, built stoves for mining cabins, shared trench designs with trading posts so deep in the hills they didn't see sunlight from November to March. He never called himself an expert, just someone who remembered. His son, the widow's grandson, was the first to sketch a full diagram on stitched deer hide that could be rolled up and kept dry even during a blizzard. That diagram became the basis for what would eventually be etched in copper and nailed to every communal post office from the Badlands to the Wyoming Pass. The life stove, build it wrong, let it work. There was no other caption, none needed. Everyone knew, even if they didn't know who she was. A century after her death, a great fire swept through part of the Northern Territories. Not a house fire, a rolling flame that devoured dry grass and fences and entire barns before water or snow could stop it. Whole settlements were lost, families fled. But when the smoke cleared and the snow fell again and people tried to rebuild, it was a single trench stove, still intact beneath a crumbled stone house, that reminded them where to begin. A child uncovered it, laid her hands on the old iron plate, blackened and cold, and said, "It's like the one Mama built." Her father blinked. "What stove?" "The one she showed me, in the notebook." She reached into her coat and pulled out a cloth-bound book, its pages filled with diagrams, notes, and one weathered sentence written in ink. "Don't build to impress, build to endure." They rebuilt the house, with the trench first, always the trench first. And when the Bureau arrived later with prefabs and modern steel heaters, they were polite enough to install them outside the trench path. They knew better than to mess with what had worked longer than any of them had been alive. Somewhere, far south, there is a small shrine carved into a bluff. No statue, no candles, just a fire pit and a hollowed trench leading underground. Travelers rest there on cold nights. They don't know who built it, but the locals call it the hearth path. They say it never quite freezes, even when the wind screams and the trees groan. Sometimes when the snow settles just right and the stars are sharp above, you can hear the soft hiss of smoke rising under the ground. Not loud, not boastful, just steady. And that's how you know it's working, because someone once dug that trench, not to prove anything, but to keep someone else alive. The snow keeps coming, year after year. The faces change, the buildings rise and fall. New names appear on letters and boundary stones. But winter does not forget. It never has. And in all the places it returns to, lonely hills, wooded hollows, wind-flattened plains, there's always at least one fire that's burning wrong and keeping people alive. Wrong in the way the experts never recommended. Wrong like a trench dug sideways beneath the frost line. Wrong like a flame hidden underground. Wrong like one log lasting the whole night because someone dared to listen to the silence and shape warmth into the earth instead of fighting the cold with noise. They don't know her name in most places. She wouldn't have wanted them to. She'd say it wasn't hers anyhow. Not the heat, not the method, not even the story. She didn't invent the dirt. She just used what the ground gave her, and she never wanted praise. She wanted the smoke to rise gently through the reed pipe and vanish into the dark without catching anyone's throat. She wanted her children to wake up still breathing. She wanted one more morning. But the people remember her. In every place, a mother lights a trench stove for the first time and lays her child beside it. In every village where smoke curls low to the ground instead of high into the sky. In every frost-bitten camp where strangers huddle near the warmth and whisper, "It doesn't look like a stove, but it works." They remember her, even if they don't say her name. In a remote pass in the high ridges beyond Harrow Hollow, where no wagons ever traveled after October, and snow could bury a cabin in 3 hours, a ranger once found a family alive in a place where no family should have survived. 3 children, 2 parents, no chimney, no stacked logs, just a hole in the earth, a shallow curve in the snow, and inside, quiet heat, steady warmth, and a woman who stood at the door holding a ladle of broth, offering it to the stranger without asking a thing in return. "How'd you do it?" the ranger asked. She only said, "It's a widow's stove." He paused. "You mean a trench fire?" She nodded. "Same thing, different name." "Where'd you learn it?" She shrugged. "My mother taught me, said her grandmother used it in the longest night." He blinked. "The what?" But she was already turning back inside, and the warmth drifted after her. In the lower territories, they built them from bricks now, machine-pressed, labeled, packed in crates that read Life Stove Kit, modeled Baruan. The kits came with instructions and were shipped to frontier hospitals, ranger posts and schoolhouses where winters snapped hard. Some were installed wrong, some were too shallow or too short, some caught smoke and had to be redone. But every so often, a child or a woman or a quiet man would step forward and correct the mistake without making a scene. They'd add a vent at the right angle, seal a curve with wet clay, drop a bundle of dried moss into the feeder pit, then wait without speaking until the heat came steady and sure. "Where'd you learn that?" someone would ask, and the answer would always be some version of, "My grandfather showed me. My aunt taught me. I read it in a binder wrapped in oilcloth." They say a widow built the first one wrong, and then someone would ask, "Did she really save a whole town?" The answer never changed. She saved her children. That was enough. In time, schools started teaching it as history, not just frontier mechanics, but survival. In the class where students learned to set traps and make shelter from snow, there was always a lesson near the end of the term when the frost set in for the earth stove. Some teachers taught it as folklore, adding a little flair, letting the story stretch. How she dug with her bare hands, how she lit the last fire with her husband's wedding ring, how the children were already blue when the heat came up through the floor. Some stuck to the facts. A woman, alone, built a stove in the ground when every other option failed, and it worked. Some asked students to build one for practice. Others insisted they try to keep a pot warm overnight with only one log. Those who failed would understand the challenge. Those who succeeded would never forget it, but none dismissed it, because in places where the snow still broke fences and buried oxen standing, there was no room for dismissal, only for fire that worked. A letter was found once, buried deep in the cellar of a burned trading post near the Pine Gulch. It was sealed in wax and charred around the edges, but most of it still legible. Dated the year after her death, it was addressed to no one in particular. The writing was rough, clearly dictated. It read, "To whoever finds this, the ground holds what the wind forgets. You want to last the night? Don't ask the flame to do all the work. Dig, bend, seal it shut. Let the heat walk under you, not above. If you're cold, don't wait for someone to fix it. Try, even if it's wrong. The fire won't care. It just wants a way in." It was unsigned, but someone added a pencil note at the bottom years later. "From the widow," they say, "the one who built it wrong." That letter is now pinned in a frame in the corner of a chapel-turned-archive house, where settlers once warmed their hands over her original stove. They keep it under glass, not because it's fragile, but because it burns still. So the next time the frost comes hard, when you're alone or low on wood, or when the storm takes the roof and the fire sputters out, you'll remember a story, a woman mocked by men who thought her foolish, digging in the dirt with frozen fingers, packing stones and pipe and soot into the ground, lighting one last log, not for light, not for pride, just to keep her children warm. And when the wind beats against your walls, when the dark feels long and cruel, you'll think of that trench, that iron plate, that slow, smoldering breath of warmth coming up through the floor, even when nothing else holds. And you'll try, even if you've never done it before, even if they tell you it's wrong. You'll dig, you'll build, you'll burn one log, and you'll live, because she did, because she showed you how, because she paid attention when no one else did, because she built her stove wrong, and it saved the world anyway.